Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, and that's perfectly fine. Before you drift off tonight, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. It was spring in the American Midwest, that brief window when the harsh winter finally releases its grip and the world begins to bloom again. In cities like Indianapolis, Wichita, and Kansas City, people were emerging from months of cold, ready to embrace warmer days. Small businesses were preparing for increased foot traffic. Shop owners were optimistic. Life felt normal, predictable, safe. Robin Fuldower was one of those people embracing the promise of spring. At just 26 years old, she had her whole life ahead of her. Robin worked at a small ceramic shop called Four Seasons in Indianapolis, a modest store tucked into a strip mall along East 82nd Street. The shop wasn't glamorous, but Robin didn't need glamour. She was a woman of simple pleasures and genuine warmth. Her co-workers described her as friendly, always ready with a smile for customers. She treated everyone who walked through the door with respect and kindness. Robin wasn't just working to pay bills, she had dreams. She wanted to build something meaningful with her life, perhaps start her own business one day. She talked about travel, about seeing places beyond Indiana. She spoke of wanting to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than she found it. Those who knew Robin said she had an infectious optimism, the kind that made people feel better just by being around her. On the morning April 8, 1992, Robin arrived at the Four Seasons ceramic shop just like any other day. She unlocked the door, turned on the lights, arranged the displays. The shop was quiet in those early hours, the way small retail stores often are before the world fully wakes up. Robin didn't mind the quiet. She used the time to organize inventory, dust shelves, prepare for whatever customers the day might bring. She had no way of knowing that this day would be different. No way of knowing, with murder on his mind, was already in the area, already selecting his target. Around 11:00 in the morning, a customer entered the shop. Robin would have greeted him the way she greeted everyone, with warmth, with professionalism, with trust. She had no reason to be afraid. This was Indianapolis, not some crime-ridden metropolis. This was a ceramic shop in a strip mall, a place where people bought decorative items and craft supplies. What threat could possibly exist here? The man didn't browse. He didn't pick up products or ask questions about prices. Instead, he pulled out a .22 caliber handgun. Robin barely had time to react. The shot was precise, calculated, executed with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before, or who was about to do it again and again. The bullet struck Robin in the head. She collapsed behind the counter, her life ending in an instant, her dreams dying with her. The killer didn't rob the store. The cash register remained untouched. This wasn't about money. This was about something else entirely, something darker, something the investigators who would soon arrive couldn't yet comprehend. The man walked out of the Four Seasons ceramic shop as calmly as he had entered, leaving Robin's body lying in a pool of blood. He disappeared in the spring day, just another face in the crowd, just another person going about their business. It was hours before Robin was found. When the first customer finally entered the shop that afternoon and discovered her body, the screams brought people running. The police were called. Within minutes, the strip mall was swarming with squad cars, their lights flashing blue and red against the storefronts. Detective work began immediately, but there was so little to go on. No witnesses had seen the shooting. The killer had left behind no obvious evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no shell casings. Just Robin's body and a single bullet wound that spoke of execution rather than passion, calculation rather than chaos. The investigators initially treated it as an isolated incident. Perhaps a robbery gone wrong, though the untouched cash register complicated that theory. Maybe it was personal, an ex-boyfriend, a stalker, someone with a grudge. They began interviewing people who knew Robin, searching for anyone who might have wanted her dead. But Robin had no enemies. She was universally liked. There were no angry ex-lovers, no business disputes, no family conflicts that might explain such violence. Everyone described her the same way: kind, hardworking, friendly. She didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this. But Robin especially didn't deserve this. The case might have remained a tragic mystery, just another unsolved murder in a country that sees thousands every year. But then, just 3 days later, something happened that changed everything. On April 11, 1992, 3 days after Robin Foldor was murdered in Indianapolis, another small business owner was opening up shop in a different city. Wichita, Kansas sat roughly 500 miles west of Indianapolis, connected by Interstate 70, that great artery of American commerce and travel. Patricia Majors owned a bridal shop called Bridal Mart on East Kellogg, one of Wichita's main commercial streets. Patricia, known to friends as Patty, was 32 years old, a mother, a wife, and a successful businesswoman. She had built her bridal shop from nothing, pouring her heart and energy into creating a place where brides could find their perfect dresses, where dreams of wedding days could begin to take shape. Patty was beloved in her community. Customers didn't just come to her shop for dresses, they came because they trusted her taste, valued her advice, appreciated her genuine investment in making their special days perfect. She remembered names, asked about families, celebrated alongside her clients. The shop wasn't just a business. It was an extension of Patty herself. Working alongside Patty that morning was Patricia Smith, a 23-year-old employee who had been with the shop for over a year. Patricia Smith, who went by her middle name Michael, was engaged to be married herself. She worked at the bridal shop partly out of love for the work and partly because of the employee discount she could use for her own upcoming wedding. She and Patty had become close, more like friends than employer and employee. That Saturday morning started like countless others. The two Patricias opened the shop, turned on the lights, prepared the displays. They chatted about upcoming appointments, about dresses that needed alterations, about the excitement of the weekend ahead. Bridal Mart was a happy place, filled with white dresses and dreams of future joy. Around 11:10 a.m., a man entered the shop. Both women would have greeted him, though it was unusual for a man to enter a bridal shop alone. Usually men came with their fiancées, looking uncomfortable among the lace and satin. But this man was alone, and something about him immediately felt wrong. He pulled out a .22 caliber handgun. Patty and Patricia Smith had only seconds to understand what was happening. The man ordered them to the back of the store, away from the windows, away from any passing pedestrians who might glance inside. The two women complied, terrified, hoping that compliance would save their lives. It didn't. The man shot both women in the head, execution style. The shots were precise, calculated, identical to the shot that had killed Robin Foldor 3 days earlier in Indianapolis. Patty Majors died instantly. Patricia Smith, despite being shot in the head, somehow survived. Though she would be left in a coma, her brain severely damaged, her life forever changed. The killer left the shop as calmly as he had entered. He took nothing of value. The cash register remained closed, the expensive wedding dresses untouched. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely. The bodies were discovered hours later when Patricia Smith's fiancé arrived at the shop, worried because she hadn't answered her phone. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman he loved lying in a pool of blood, clinging to life by the thinnest thread, and her employer, Patty Majors, already gone. The Wichita Police Department responded with full force. Detectives processed the crime scene, interviewed potential witnesses, canvassed the neighborhood. They found very little physical evidence. Like the Indianapolis murder, the killer had been careful, methodical, almost professional in his efficiency. But this time they had something Indianapolis hadn't had: a survivor. Patricia Smith was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save her life. The bullet had caused catastrophic damage to her brain, but miraculously she lived. She remained in a coma for weeks, hovering between life and death. When she finally regained consciousness, the damage was severe. She had lost much of her memory, including any clear recollection of her attacker's face. The trauma had erased crucial details, leaving investigators with fragments rather than a complete picture. Still, Patricia could provide some information. She remembered a man entering the store. She remembered the feeling of wrongness, the sudden appearance of the gun, the terror of those final moments. She described him as white, somewhere in his 20s or 30s, with reddish or sandy blonde hair. Average height, Average build, the kind of person who could disappear into any crowd. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Wichita investigators worked to piece together what had happened at Bridal Mart, news of the murder reached Indianapolis. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both victims were women working in small retail shops. Both were killed mid-morning on weekends. Both were shot in the head with what appeared to be a .22 caliber weapon, and both crime scenes showed no signs of robbery or sexual assault. Two detectives in two different cities began to wonder if they were dealing with the same killer. Then came the geographical connection that would give this killer his name. Both cities sat along Interstate 70. Robin Fuldauer's ceramic shop in Indianapolis was less than 2 miles from an I-70 exit. Patty Major's bridal shop in Wichita was similarly close to the interstate. It was as if the killer was using the highway as his hunting ground, moving from city to city, selecting victims at random, striking without warning. But before investigators could establish a definitive link, before task forces could be formed or patterns fully analyzed, the killer struck again. Just 16 days after the Wichita murders, on April 27, 1992, another shop owner opened for business in yet another Midwestern city. Nancy Kitzmiller was 34 years old and living her dream. She owned a small boot shop in St. Charles, Missouri, a charming historic city on the banks of the Missouri River, just outside St. Louis. Nancy's shop, called the Boot Village, specialized in Western wear, cowboy boots, leather goods, the kind of rugged Americana that never goes out of style. Nancy was a single mother, raising her daughter while building her business. It wasn't easy balancing parenthood with entrepreneurship, but Nancy made it work through sheer determination and love for what she did. Her daughter was her world, her reason for working so hard, her motivation to build something lasting and meaningful. Those who knew Nancy described her as vivacious and strong. She didn't fit the stereotype of a victim. She was confident, capable, independent. She had built her life on her own terms, and she was proud of what she had accomplished. The boot shop was more than a business. It was proof that a single mother could make it, could provide for her child, could create something of value. That Monday morning, Nancy arrived at the Boot Village and began her routine. She unlocked the door, turned on the lights, arranged the displays of boots and Western wear. The shop was located in a quiet area of St. Charles, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where crime was rare and trust was common. Around 11 a.m. That same deadly time slot that was becoming a pattern, a man entered the shop. Nancy greeted him professionally, ready to help him find whatever he needed. Perhaps he seemed like a legitimate customer. Perhaps he browsed for a moment, creating the illusion of normalcy. But then, just as in Indianapolis and Wichita, the man pulled out a .22 caliber handgun. The shot was precise, just like the others. Nancy Kitzmiller fell behind the counter, killed instantly by a bullet to the head. Her daughter would grow up without a mother. Her dreams of building something were cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The killer left the Boot Village without taking anything of value. Once again, the cash register was untouched. Once again, there was no sexual assault, no apparent motive beyond the murder itself. The man simply walked out of the shop and disappeared. Nancy's body was discovered later that day by a customer who became concerned when no one answered the bell. The police arrived to find a scene that was becoming horrifyingly familiar. A woman shot execution style in her own shop, minimal evidence, no witnesses, no clear motive. The St. Charles Police Department began their investigation, processing the crime scene, interviewing neighbors and potential witnesses. They found very little to work with. Like the previous murders, this one had been carried out with chilling efficiency. The killer had left almost no trace of his presence. But this time, investigators across multiple states were beginning to connect the dots. When news of Nancy Kitzmiller's murder reached Indianapolis and Wichita, detectives immediately recognized the pattern. 3 murders in 3 different cities, all within 19 days. All victims were women working alone in small retail shops. All were killed mid-morning with a .22 caliber weapon. All shops were located near Interstate 70. And all crime scenes showed the same lack of robbery or sexual assault. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a serial killer working his way along the interstate, and he was accelerating. Law enforcement agencies began sharing information, comparing notes, building a profile of their killer. He was white, based on the description from Patricia Smith, the Wichita survivor. He was likely in his 20s or 30s. He had reddish or sandy blonde hair. He was average in height and build, utterly unremarkable in appearance. The kind of person who could blend into any environment. But beyond these basic descriptors, the killer remained a ghost. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, no shell casings. He chose his victims apparently at random, which made predicting his next move nearly impossible. There was no sexual component to the crimes, which ruled out certain psychological profiles. There was no robbery, which eliminated financial desperation as a motive. What drove this man to kill? Why target shop workers? Why stick to Interstate 70? These questions haunted investigators as they raced to prevent the next murder. They wouldn't be fast enough. On May 3, 1992, just 6 days after Nancy Kitzmiller's murder, another woman was starting her work week in another city along Interstate 70. Sarah Blessing was 38 years old and living in Raytown, Missouri, a suburb of Kansas City. She worked at a small store called the State Street Fabric Shop, a place where crafters and seamstresses came to buy materials for their projects. Sarah was an experienced employee, someone customers trusted for advice on patterns, fabrics, and techniques. Sarah was a devoted mother and wife. Her family was everything to her. She worked at the fabric shop partly for income, and partly because she genuinely enjoyed helping people with their creative projects. She understood that for many customers, the fabric they purchased would become cherished quilts, clothing for grandchildren, curtains that would hang in homes for decades. She treated her work with care and dignity. That Sunday morning, Sarah arrived at the State Street Fabric Shop ready for another day. Sundays were often busy at fabric stores, people with regular days off to shop for hobby projects. Sarah expected a steady stream of customers. The morning started quietly. Around 11:15 a.m., a man entered the shop. Sarah would have greeted him warmly, perhaps surprised to see a man shopping for fabric alone, but ready to help nonetheless. Maybe he said he was looking for something specific. Maybe he pretended to browse. Or maybe he immediately revealed his true purpose. He pulled out a .22 caliber handgun and shot Sarah Blessing in the head. She collapsed among the bolts of fabric, her blood staining the colorful materials she had spent her morning organizing. The killer left immediately, taking nothing, leaving behind only death. Sarah's body was discovered shortly afterward when another customer entered the shop. The screams brought people running. The Kansas City area police responded with every available unit. They processed the scene, interviewed witnesses, searched for any clue that might identify the killer. They found almost nothing. The pattern continued: a woman alone in a small shop, killed mid-morning with a .22 caliber weapon, no robbery, no sexual assault, a location near Interstate 70. But this time there was a crucial difference. Witnesses had seen a man leaving the area around the time of the murder. He had been spotted getting into a car, a light-colored vehicle, possibly a Dodge from the mid-1980s. The description matched what Patricia Smith, the Wichita survivor, had provided about her attacker. Investigators now had a vehicle description to add to their profile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Police across the Midwest began looking for a white male in his 20s or early 30s, with reddish blonde hair, driving a light-colored mid-1980s sedan. Highway patrol officers were alerted. Shop owners were warned. The media began reporting on the serial killer stalking Interstate 70. But despite the warnings, despite the increased vigilance, the killer struck again. On May 7, 1992, just 4 days after Sarah Blessing's murder, Mildred Hodges was working at her shop in Indiana. Mildred was 65 years old, a grandmother, a beloved member of her community. She had worked for years at a small gift shop called Sylvia's Ceramics, located on Wabash Avenue, not far from Interstate 70. After so many years in the business, Mildred knew her regular customers by name. She knew their families, their tastes, their lives. The shop was a gathering place as much as a business, a spot where people came not just to buy ceramics but to chat, to catch up, to feel connected to their community. Mildred had lived a full life. She had raised children, welcomed grandchildren, contributed to her community in countless small ways. At 65, she could have retired, could have spent her days relaxing, enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work. But Mildred loved her job. She loved the people, the routine, the sense of purpose it gave her. That Thursday morning, Mildred arrived at Sylvia's Ceramics and prepared for another day. She was alone in the shop, as she often was during the slower morning hours. The store wouldn't get busy until the afternoon, when people got off work and stopped by to browse. Around 11:30 a.m., a man entered the ceramics shop. Mildred would have smiled at him, would have asked if she could help him find something. She had spent decades perfecting the art of customer service, of making people feel welcome and valued. She had no reason to fear this stranger. The man pulled out a .22 caliber handgun and shot Mildred Hodges in the head. She died instantly, collapsing among the ceramic figurines and decorative items she had spent the morning arranging. The killer left without taking anything, without disturbing the cash register, without leaving any evidence that might identify him. Mildred's body was found hours later when her boss arrived for the afternoon shift. The scene was heartbreakingly familiar to investigators who had been tracking the I-70 killer, a woman alone in a small shop, killed mid-morning with a .22 caliber weapon. No robbery, no sexual assault. A location near Interstate 70. But this murder had a particular cruelty to it. Mildred Hodges was 65 years old. She was a grandmother, a woman who had lived through World War II, who had raised a family, who had contributed to her community for decades. She represented everything good about small-town America: hard work, kindness, dedication, service to others. And she had been executed like all the rest, killed for no apparent reason by a man who seemed to murder simply because he could. The murder of Mildred Hodges brought the total to 5 victims in 29 days. The killer had struck in Indiana, Kansas, and Missouri, always along Interstate 70, always targeting women working alone in small shops, always using the same weapon and method. Law enforcement agencies across the Midwest were now fully coordinating their efforts. A task force was formed, bringing together detectives from multiple jurisdictions. The FBI became involved, offering resources and expertise in serial killer profiling. Investigators began analyzing every detail of the crimes, looking for patterns that might predict the killer's next move or reveal his identity. They mapped the murders geographically, noting that the killer seemed to be moving both east and west along Interstate 70. They analyzed the timing, noting that most murders occurred mid-morning, between 11 a.m. and noon, typically on weekends or less busy weekdays. They studied the victims, searching for any connection beyond the obvious. Robin Foldauer sold ceramics. Patricia Majors sold wedding dresses. Nancy Kitzmiller sold boots. Sarah Blessing sold fabric. Mildred Hodges sold ceramics. The variety of merchandise suggested the shop sales weren't specifically targeted, rather, the killer was selecting victims based on opportunity and vulnerability. All the victims were white women, but their ages ranged from 23 to 65. There was no clear pattern in age preference, which made the crimes even more disturbing. This wasn't a killer with a specific type. This was someone who killed women simply because they were there. Accessible, vulnerable. The psychological profile that emerged was chilling. This was a killer who murdered not out of passion or rage, but out of something colder and more calculated. He felt no need to rob his victims, which suggested the murders themselves were his goal. He felt no need to sexually assault them, which ruled out the sexual sadism that drives many serial killers. He simply walked into shops, shot women in the head, and left. This suggested a killer who derived satisfaction from the act of murder itself, from the power of ending a life, from the control he exercised in those brief moments. Psychologists consulted by the task force suggested the killer might be experiencing some form of sexual gratification from the murders themselves, even without physical contact. The precision of the shots, the consistent method, the apparent calmness with which he operated, all suggested a deeply disturbed individual who had likely fantasized about these murders before carrying them out. But understanding the killer's psychology didn't help investigators find him. He remained a ghost, appearing and disappearing along Interstate 70, leaving death in his wake. Shop owners throughout the Midwest lived in fear. Many hired additional security. Some installed panic buttons. Others began working in pairs, refusing to be alone in their shops during those vulnerable morning hours. The local media covered the story extensively, warning the public about the I-70 killer, urging vigilance, asking anyone with information to come forward. Tips poured into police departments across multiple states. Every light-colored sedan with a male driver became suspicious. Every man with reddish blonde hair was scrutinized. Police followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, investigated dozens of persons of interest. But the killer remained one step ahead. He had vanished after Mildred Hodges' murder, leaving investigators to wonder when and where he would strike next. They wouldn't have to wait long. 3 days after Mildred Hodges was murdered in Terre Haute, Indiana, the I-70 killer claimed his sixth and final confirmed victim. But this murder would be different from the others in one critical way. This time, the killer would make a mistake. On May 10, 1992, a Sunday morning, a young woman named Vicki Heath was working at a small shoe store in St. Charles, Missouri, the same city where Nancy Kitzmiller had been murdered just 13 days earlier. The fact that the killer would return to the same city so quickly was unusual, and it suggested a certain boldness, perhaps even arrogance, on his part. Vicki Heath was only 23 years old, just beginning her adult life. She worked at a store called the Store of Many Colors, located in a small shopping center on Highway 94 near the I-70 interchange. The shop sold shoes, boots, and accessories, the kind of small retail establishment that had become the I-70 killer's preferred hunting ground. Vicki was engaged to be married. She and her fiancé had been planning their wedding, making arrangements for their future together, building dreams the way young couples do. She worked at the shoe store to save money for their life together, earning an honest living while looking forward to better days ahead. Those who knew Vicki described her as sweet and caring, someone who lit up a room when she entered. She was the kind of person who made friends easily, who treated everyone with kindness, who saw the best in people. Her family adored her. Her fiancé loved her deeply. She had everything to live for. That Sunday morning, Vicki arrived at the Store of Many Colors and began her shift. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind that makes people want to get out of the house, maybe do some shopping, enjoy the sunshine. Vicki would have been expecting a decent amount of foot traffic. Around 11:30 in the morning, a man entered the store. Vicki greeted him with her characteristic warmth, ready to help him find whatever he needed. She had no way of knowing that 5 other women had been killed in the past month by a man who fit this customer's description. She had no way of knowing that she was about to become the 6th victim. The man pulled out a .22 caliber handgun. But this time something went wrong, at least from the killer's perspective. Vicki didn't die immediately. The shot didn't achieve the instant kill that had characterized the previous murders. Instead, Vicki was gravely wounded but still alive, still conscious, still able to react. What happened in those next moments would provide investigators with their most detailed account yet of the I-70 killer's method and appearance. Vicki, despite being shot, fought for her life. She tried to escape, tried to call for help, tried to survive. The killer, perhaps panicked by the fact that his victim wasn't dead, fired again, then again. Vicki Heath was shot 3 times before she finally collapsed. But even mortally wounded, Vicki managed to trigger the store's silent alarm. The signal went out to police, alerting them that something terrible was happening at the Store of Many Colors. The killer fled the scene, but this time he had been forced to spend more time in the store than he had planned. This time his victim had fought back, had made noise, had created a scene that was far messier than his previous murders. This time he had made mistakes. Police arrived within minutes of the alarm being triggered. They found Vicki Heath lying on the floor, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics were called immediately, and they worked frantically to save her life, but the damage was too severe. Vicki died shortly after arriving at the hospital. But before she died, she was able to give investigators crucial information. In those final moments of consciousness, Vicki described her attacker. She confirmed what Patricia Smith had said after the Wichita shooting: a white male in his 20s or early 30s with reddish or sandy blonde hair, average height, average build. But Vicki provided additional details: the way he moved, the cold expression on his face, the methodical nature of his actions. More importantly, because the killer had been forced to spend more time at the scene. Because the murder had been messier and more tonic than the others, he had left behind more evidence. Witnesses in the shopping center had seen a man fleeing the area. They had seen him get into a light-colored vehicle and speed away. The descriptions matched previous sightings. For the first time, investigators had multiple witnesses who could corroborate each other's accounts. For the first time, the killer had been forced to deviate from his careful plan. For the first time, he had left behind evidence that might actually lead somewhere. The scene. Charles Police Department processed the crime scene with meticulous care, knowing they were dealing with a serial killer who had now claimed 6 lives in just over a month. They collected ballistic evidence, fingerprints, fibers, anything that might provide a clue to the killer's identity. The ballistics analysis confirmed what investigators had suspected. All 6 murders had been committed with .22 caliber weapons, and the rifling patterns suggested they might all have been fired from the same gun. This was definitive proof that a single killer was responsible for all 6 murders. The task force investigating the I-70 killer went into overdrive. They knew that serial killers who operate on such a compressed timeline, 6 murders in 29 days, typically don't stop on their own. The fact that the killer had returned to St. Charles just 13 days after killing Nancy Kitzmiller there suggested he was becoming bolder, more confident, perhaps even more reckless. Investigators feared he would strike again soon, and they were determined to stop him before another woman died. The murder of Vicky Heath marked a turning point in the investigation. With 6 confirmed victims and a clear pattern established, law enforcement agencies across the country were on high alert. The I-70 killer case became national news, featured on television programs, discussed in newspapers from coast to coast. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit became heavily involved, applying their expertise in serial killer psychology to build a more comprehensive profile of the perpetrator. Their analysis painted a disturbing picture of the man they were hunting. The killer was almost certainly male, likely white based on eyewitness descriptions. He was probably between 25 and 30, 5 years old, young enough to be physically capable and mobile, old enough to have developed the psychological pathology that drove him to kill. The choice of weapon, a .22 caliber handgun, was significant. It was small, easily concealed, relatively quiet compared to larger calibers. .22 is often called an assassin's weapon because it's effective at close range but doesn't create the loud report of larger handguns. The killer could fire the weapon in a store and not immediately alert people in neighboring shops or on the street outside. The precision of the shots suggested someone comfortable with firearms, possibly someone with military or law enforcement training, or perhaps just an experienced shooter. The fact that he could walk into a store, shoot someone in the head, and walk out calmly suggested a chilling level of emotional detachment. The geographical pattern, sticking close to Interstate 70, suggested someone who traveled frequently, possibly for work. Truck drivers, traveling salesmen, construction workers who moved from job to job, these were all possibilities. The killer needed a job that would explain his presence in multiple cities, that wouldn't raise suspicion when he disappeared for hours at a time. The timing of the murders was also telling. Most occurred mid-morning between 11 and other a.m. and noon, often on weekends or slower weekdays. This suggested someone who had flexibility in their schedule, who could choose when to strike based on opportunity, rather than being constrained by a rigid work schedule. The choice of victims, women working alone in small retail shops, revealed both cowardice and calculation. These were vulnerable targets, isolated, unable to defend themselves or call for help before it was too late. The killer didn't target men, didn't target shops with multiple employees, didn't take risks. He chose the easiest possible victims, which suggested someone who felt powerless in other areas of his life, someone who needed to feel dominant and in control. The lack of robbery was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the crimes. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about supporting a drug habit or funding some desperate need. This was murder for murder's sake. The killer derived satisfaction from the act itself, from the planning, the execution, the power, the control, the ending of a life. Psychologists suggested the killer might be experiencing sexual gratification from the murders. achieving arousal or release from the act of killing rather than from any physical contact with the victims. This type of pathology is rare but not unknown among serial killers. It suggested a profoundly disturbed individual whose sexual impulses had become twisted and redirected toward violence. The profile suggested someone who likely lived alone, who struggled with relationships, who felt alienated from society. Someone who harbored deep resentment toward women, perhaps stemming from childhood trauma, maternal issues, or romantic rejection. Someone who had probably fantasized about murder for years before actually carrying it out. But profiles are only lead to a suspect, and despite the detailed psychological portrait, investigators still didn't have a name, an address, or any concrete lead that pointed to a specific individual. As the investigation intensified, police began re-examining every piece of evidence from all 6 crime scenes, looking for any detail they might have missed, any connection they hadn't yet made. The Robin Fuldauer crime scene in Indianapolis was the first, and investigators wondered if the killer had been less experienced then, if he might have made mistakes he would later learn to avoid. They went back through the evidence, the ballistics reports, the witness statements, the forensic analysis. They looked for fibers, hairs, fingerprints, anything that might have been overlooked in the initial investigation when they thought they were dealing with an isolated incident. The Wichita crime scene, where Patricia Majors had been killed and Patricia Smith had survived, was examined with renewed intensity. Patricia Smith, the survivor, was interviewed multiple times, gently pressed to remember any detail she could about her attacker. The trauma had damaged her memory, but investigators hoped with time and careful questioning, additional details might emerge. Patricia remembered the gun, small, dark, held steady in the man's hand. She remembered his face, young, unremarkable, with light-colored hair. She remembered his clothes, casual, nothing distinctive, the kind of outfit anyone might wear. She remembered his voice, calm, commanding, utterly devoid of emotion. But she couldn't remember specifics that would help identify him. No unusual scars, no distinctive accent, no jewelry or tattoos that would make him stand out. The Nancy Kitzmiller crime scene in St. Charles was reprocessed with the knowledge that the killer would return to the same city just 13 days later to murder Vicky Heath. Investigators wondered if there was something about St. Charles that drew the killer, some connection to the city that made him comfortable operating there. They interviewed residents, business owners, hotel clerks, anyone who might have noticed a stranger hanging around in late April and early May of 1992. They looked at hotel registrations, trying to find someone who'd been in the area during both murders. They checked employment records for anyone who might have had work assignments in St. Charles during those dates. The Sarah Blessing crime scene in Raytown, Missouri, was significant because witnesses had seen the suspect's vehicle. Police worked with witnesses to create a more detailed description of the car, a light-colored mid-1980s sedan, possibly a Dodge or Plymouth, in good condition. They checked motor vehicle registration records across multiple states, trying to narrow down possible vehicles. The Mildred Hodges crime scene in Terre Haute was particularly heartbreaking to revisit. At 65, Mildred had been the oldest victim, a grandmother who should have been safe in her workplace. Investigators wondered if the killer had specifically targeted her because of her age, viewing her as even more vulnerable than the younger victims, or if her age had been irrelevant to him, just another person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And finally, the Vicky Heath crime scene in St. Charles provided the most evidence. Because Vicky had fought back, because the murder had taken longer and been messier, because she had triggered the alarm and police had arrived quickly, the crime scene was fresher, less contaminated by time. Investigators went over every inch of the store, collecting evidence, photographing everything, building the most complete picture yet of how the killer operated. Forensic specialists examined the bullet trajectories, trying to understand the exact sequence of events. The first shot had wounded Vicky but hadn't killed her. The killer had then fired twice more, with at least one of those shots being the fatal wound. The spent bullets were recovered and sent to ballistics experts for comparison with the bullets from the other crime scenes. Under microscopic analysis, the bullets told a story. The rifling marks, the distinctive grooves left by the barrel of a gun, were consistent across all 6 crime scenes. The firearms examiner was confident all 6 women had been shot with the same weapon, or at minimum, with identical marks. Given the rarity of such a coincidence, the conclusion was clear: one gun, one killer. But knowing the murder weapon didn't help identify the killer. .22 caliber handguns were common, owned by millions of Americans. Without the actual weapon to test, fire, and compare, without a suspect to tie to the gun, the ballistics evidence only confirmed what investigators already knew: they were hunting a serial killer. While the forensic teams worked in laboratories, detectives were pounding the pavement, following up on the thousands of tips that had poured in from the public. Every call, every letter, every anonymous tip had to be investigated, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Some tips seemed promising initially but led nowhere. A man matching a description was seen near one of the crime scenes, but when located and interviewed, he had a solid alibi. A .22 caliber handgun was found in a dumpster near Interstate 70, but ballistics testing showed it wasn't the murder weapon. A witness claimed to have seen the killer's vehicle, but the license plate number they provided belonged to a vehicle that didn't match the description. Other tips were clearly the product of paranoia or grudges. People called to report suspicious neighbors, ex-husbands, coworkers they didn't like. Everyone who seemed strange or made them uncomfortable suddenly became a potential serial killer. Police had to investigate each claim, wasting valuable time on dead ends while the killer remained free. The media coverage, while helpful in generating public awareness, also created problems. Every news story about the I-70 killer prompted copycat crimes and false confessions. Disturbed individuals came forward claiming to be the killer, seeking attention or notoriety. Each of these people had to be interviewed and cleared, diverting resources from the actual investigation. One particularly frustrating lead involved a man who had been seen in multiple cities along I-70 during the time frame of the murders. He matched the physical description: white, late 20s, reddish blonde hair, average build. He drove a light-colored sedan. He traveled for work, explaining his presence in multiple locations. He was even stopped by police for a traffic violation in Kansas just days before the Wichita murders. Investigators tracked him down, brought him in for questioning, checked his alibi for each of the murder dates. For a brief, hopeful moment, the task force thought they had their man. But the alibis held up. For each murder, he could prove he was somewhere else, at a work site with multiple witnesses, checked into a hotel in a different city, meeting with clients who confirmed his whereabouts. He wasn't the I-70 killer. He was just an unfortunate man who happened to match the profile. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times, promising leads that turned into dead ends. Suspects who looked perfect on paper, but couldn't be definitively placed at any of the crime scenes. Tips that seemed credible but couldn't be verified. The investigation became a grinding process of elimination, narrowing down thousands of possibilities, hoping to eventually isolate the one true suspect. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. It had been only days since Vicky Hith's murder. If the killer followed his established pattern, he would strike again soon. Police departments throughout the Midwest put all available officers on alert. Shop owners were contacted and warned. Some stores hired security guards. Others installed surveillance cameras. Many simply closed during the vulnerable mid-morning hours when the killer preferred to strike. Interstate 70 itself became a focus of intense police activity. Highway patrol officers watched for vehicles matching the description, looking for suspicious behavior at rest stops and gas stations. Undercover officers posed as shop workers in vulnerable stores, hoping to catch the killer in the act. Surveillance teams monitored high-risk areas, ready to respond at the first sign of trouble. But the killer seemed to sense the increased police presence. He didn't strike again. Days turned into weeks and no new murders were reported. The heightened state of alert began to wear on everyone involved. Police couldn't maintain maximum vigilance indefinitely. Shop owners couldn't afford to keep their stores closed or pay for private security forever. The media attention began to fade as news stories took precedence. The I-70 killer seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. As weeks turned into months without a new murder, Investigators began to consider various scenarios to explain the killer's sudden disappearance. One possibility was that he had simply stopped killing, either because the increased police pressure had scared him off, or because whatever psychological need drove him to murder had been temporarily satisfied. Some serial killers do experience cooling off periods between active phases, sometimes lasting months or even years. Another possibility was that the killer had been arrested for an unrelated crime and was currently in jail, unable to continue his murder spree. The task force cross-referenced arrest records from across the country, looking for anyone who had been taken into custody around the time the murders stopped. Anyone who matched the profile and had access to a .22 caliber weapon. A darker possibility was that the killer had moved to a different area, perhaps targeting victims in a way that didn't match his established pattern, making it impossible to connect new crimes to the I-70 series. Serial killers sometimes change their methods, their victim selection, their geographical area, making it difficult for law enforcement to link disparate crimes to a single perpetrator. The most disturbing possibility was that the killer was still out there, watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Perhaps he was following the news coverage, enjoying the fear he had created, savoring his ability to evade capture. Perhaps he was already selecting his next victim, stalking another vulnerable woman, preparing to murder again when the time felt right. The task force couldn't afford to assume the killing had stopped permanently. They continued their investigation, following every lead, re-examining every piece of evidence, hoping for the breakthrough that would identify the killer before he could strike again. In June of 1992, just weeks after the murder spree had apparently ended, investigators got what they thought might be that breakthrough. A man in Indiana was arrested for attempted robbery at a small retail store. During the arrest, police discovered he was carrying a .22 caliber handgun. The arresting officers, aware of the I-70 killer case, immediately flagged the arrest for the task's attention. The suspect matched the general description: white, early 30s, light-colored hair, average build. He drove an older sedan. He had no solid alibi for the dates of several murders. When questioned, he became defensive and evasive, refusing to answer certain questions, demanding a lawyer. The task force converged on this suspect with intense focus. They obtained warrants to search his home, his vehicle, his employment records. They seized his .22 caliber handgun and sent it for ballistics testing. They interviewed his family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might provide information about his whereabouts during April and May of 1992. For several tense days, investigators believed they might have finally caught the I-70 killer. The ballistics lab rushed the testing, comparing the suspect's weapon to the bullets recovered from the 6 murder scenes. The results came back negative. The gun wasn't a match. Furthermore, deeper investigation revealed that the suspect had been out of state, attending a family funeral during one of the murders. Phone records and eyewitness testimony confirmed his alibi. He wasn't the I-70 killer, just another dead end in an investigation filled with them. The disappointment was crushing. The task force had invested so much hope in this lead, had been so certain they were finally close to solving the case. The realization that they were back to square one, with no viable suspects and no new leads, took a heavy emotional toll on everyone involved, but they couldn't give up. 6 women were dead. 6 families were grieving. 6 murders were unsolved. The investigators owed it to the victims to keep searching, to never stop hunting for the man who had destroyed so many lives. As summer turned to fall in 1992, the investigation began to change character. The initial frenzy of activity, the roadblocks, the surveillance operations, the flood of tips from the public, gradually subsided. The I-70 killer case, while still very much active, became a more methodical, grinding effort. Detectives continued to work the case daily, but without new murders or fresh leads. They were largely going over the same ground repeatedly, hoping to spot something they had missed before. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, ran new database searches as technology improved and new information systems came online. The families of the victims were in a terrible limbo. They had buried their loved ones, mourned their losses, tried to rebuild their shattered lives. But without justice, without answers, without even the knowledge of who had killed their daughters, wives, mothers, and grandmothers. Closure was impossible. Robin Fuldaur's family remembered her vibrant personality, her dreams of the future, her kindness to everyone she met. They struggled to understand why anyone would want to harm her, what she could possibly have done to deserve such a fate. The randomness of her selection as a victim was somehow worse than if there had been a motive, a reason, something that made sense. Patricia Mager's husband and children tried to move forward without the woman who had been the center of their family. Her bridal shop closed, unable to continue without her guiding presence. Her clients mourned not just the loss of a businesswoman, but the loss of someone who had been part of their most important life moments, who had helped them prepare for their wedding days, who had shared in their joy. Patricia Smith, the survivor from the Wichita attack, faced a different kind of hell. The physical wounds eventually healed, but the brain damage was permanent. The wedding she had been planning never happened. Her fiancé couldn't cope with her changed condition, and their relationship ended. She required ongoing care. Her independence stolen by a man whose face she could barely remember. Nancy Kitzmiller's daughter grew up without a mother, raised by relatives who tried their best, but could never fill the void Nancy's death had created. Every birthday, every milestone was marked by her mother's absence. The boot shop closed, its inventory sold off, another small business destroyed by senseless violence. Sarah Blessing's family struggled with their faith after her murder. How could a loving God allow such evil to exist? How could someone who devoted her life to helping others, to making the world a little bit better, be cut down in such a brutal way? These questions haunted them, challenging everything they had believed about justice and meaning in the universe. Mildred Hodges' children and grandchildren lost not just a family member but a matriarch, the person who had held the family together, who had provided wisdom and stability and unconditional love. She had survived the Great Depression and World War II, decades of change and challenge, only to be murdered by a stranger in the place where she worked. The senselessness of it was overwhelming. Vicky Heath's fiancé was left with a future that would never happen, plans that would never be realized, a wedding that would never take place. He had lost not just the woman he loved, but all the years they should have had together, all the children they might have raised, all the life they should have lived. He was 23 years old and already a widower in all but name. These families waited for justice. They waited for answers. They waited for the police to call and say they had caught the killer, that he would face trial, that he would be punished for what he had done. The call never came. In 1993, as the one-year anniversary of the murders approached, the task force held a press conference to update the public on the investigation. It was a somber affair. The lead detective stood before cameras and reporters and admitted what everyone already knew despite their best efforts, despite thousands of hours of investigation, despite following every possible lead. They had not identified the I-70 killer. The investigation remained active, he assured the public. New tips were still being followed up. Evidence was still being examined. The case would never be closed until the killer was caught. But the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. The trail had gone cold. Whoever the I-70 killer was, he had successfully evaded one of the largest manhunts in Midwest history. He had murdered 6 women in 29 days and then vanished like smoke, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. The press conference did generate some new tips, as the anniversary coverage reminded people of the case and prompted them to come forward with information they might have forgotten or initially dismissed as unimportant. But none of these tips led anywhere productive. As 1993 progressed, other serial killer cases began to dominate headlines. The I-70 killer, while not forgotten, was no longer front-page news. The dedicated task force was gradually reduced in size as officers were reassigned to other cases, other priorities. A small core group continued to work the I-70 murders, but without fresh leads. There was only so much they could do. The case files remained open, organized and accessible in case new information came to light. The evidence was preserved in temperature-controlled storage, ready to be retested if new forensic techniques became available. The investigation was active in the bureaucratic sense, but in practical terms it had stalled. And then years later, something unexpected happened. A crime occurred that would reopen old wounds and raise new questions about the I-7 killer's identity and fate. On April 8, 1993, exactly 1 year to the day after Robin Fuldur was murdered in Indianapolis, investigators working the I-70 killer case received a phone call that made their blood run cold. There had been another murder, this time in Texas, and the circumstances bore an unsettling resemblance to the I-70 series. A young woman named Marianne Glasscock had been shot and killed in a bridal shop in Raytown, Texas, a small town near Amarillo. She was 23 years old, the same age Vicky Heath had been when she died. She worked alone in the shop just like the I-70 victims. She had been shot in the head with a small caliber weapon, and most significantly, the shop was located near Interstate 40, which intersects with Interstate 70 in several locations across the country. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The task force immediately requested all information about the Texas murder, hoping and fearing in equal measure that they might finally have a break in their case, or confirmation that the killer had struck again after a year of silence. When the case files arrived from Texas, investigators pored over every detail, comparing the Glasscock murder to the 6 I-70 killings. The victim profile matched a young woman working alone in a small retail shop. The location matched the pattern near a major interstate highway. The method was similar as shooting in a retail environment with no apparent robbery. But as they dug deeper, differences began to emerge. The weapon used in the Glasscock murder was a .380 caliber handgun, not the .22 caliber weapon used in the I-70 murders. The ballistics were different. The crime scene shows of a struggle that hadn't been present in most of the I-70 murders, where the victims had been shot quickly and efficiently. More importantly, when investigators obtained a description in the Texas case, it didn't match the I-70 killer profile. The man seen leaving the Raytown, Texas bridal shop was described as older, heavier, with darker hair. Witnesses provided details that simply didn't align with the reddish, blonde man in his 20s or early 30s who had terrorized the Midwest. After weeks of investigation and comparison, the task force reluctantly concluded that Marianne Glasscock's murder, despite the superficial similarities and the haunting anniversary date, was not connected to the I-70 series. It was a terrible coincidence, or perhaps a copycat crime committed by someone who had read about the I-70 killer and decided to imitate his methods. The disappointment was profound. For a brief moment, investigators had hoped they were back on the trail of their killer. Instead, they had simply been reminded that murder happens with depressing frequency, and that similar crimes don't always share a common perpetrator. But the Texas case did prompt the task force to expand their search parameters. If someone in Texas had committed a similar crime, perhaps there were other murders across the country that shared characteristics with the I-70 series, but had never been connected because they occurred outside the immediate geographical area or didn't perfectly match the pattern. Investigators began searching databases for unsolved murders of women in retail settings, looking for any case that might represent an earlier crime by the I-70 killer, a crime committed before he refined his method and established his pattern. They looked for cases that might represent later murders, crimes committed after he left the I-70 corridor and moved to a different hunting ground. This research uncovered dozens of murders that shared some characteristics with the I-70 series. Women shot in stores, women killed during robberies that didn't result in theft, women murdered in small retail environments near highways. But none of them matched the I-70 pattern closely enough to definitively link them to the same killer. The problem with trying to connect serial murders is that certain methods and victim types are common enough that coincidental similarities are inevitable. Retail workers are vulnerable targets. Small caliber handguns are common murder weapons. Interstate highways crisscross the entire country, putting thousands of businesses within close proximity to them. Without definitive physical evidence, matching ballistics, DNA, fingerprints, connecting crimes based on method and pattern alone is more art than science. Still, the investigators identified several cases that warranted closer examination. They requested case files, compared evidence, looked for any detail that might definitively link other murders to their 6 confirmed I-70 cases. One case in particular caught their attention. In 1993, investigators learned about a murder that had occurred in Terre Haute, Indiana, the same city where Mildred Hodges had been killed, just a few months before the I-70 murder series began. In January of 1992, a woman named Sylvia West had been shot and killed in a small store. She had been alone at the time. The murder weapon was believed to be a small caliber handgun. No robbery had taken place. The case had been investigated locally but never solved. At the time, there had been no reason to connect it to anything else. It was months before the I-70 series began, and there was no pattern to recognize yet. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, investigators wondered, could Sylvia West have been the I-70 killer's first victim? Could this January 1992 murder represent his initial foray into serial killing, a test run before he began his rapid-fire murder spree in April? The Terre Haute Police Department pulled the Sylvia West case file and shared it with the I-70 task force. Investigators compared every available detail: the victim profile, the crime scene photos, the witness statements, the ballistic evidence. The similarities were intriguing. Sylvia West had been shot in the head while working alone in a small store. The murder appeared to be motiveless. Nothing was stolen, and there was no evidence of sexual assault. The store was located near Interstate 70, but there were also differences. Sylvia West was older than most of the I-70 victims, in her late 40s rather than her 20s or 30s. The crime scene showed more signs of disorganization, suggesting either panic or inexperience on the killer's part. And crucially, the ballistics evidence was inconclusive. The bullet that killed Sylvia West was too damaged for definitive comparison to the I-70 murder bullets. Without conclusive ballistic evidence, investigators couldn't definitively link the Sylvia West murder to the I-70 series. It remained a tantalizing possibility, a case that might represent the killer's first murder, but it could never be confirmed with the evidence available. This became a recurring theme in the investigation: possible connections that could never be proven, potential leads that ended in frustration, evidence that suggested but never confirmed. As the mid-1990s arrived, the I-70 killer investigation entered a new phase characterized by waiting and hoping. Waiting for the killer to make a mistake, hoping that advancing forensic technology might provide answers that traditional detective work could not. DNA analysis was revolutionizing criminal investigation during this period. What had once been science fiction was becoming routine police work. Evidence that had been collected in 1992 and stored carefully could now be analyzed in ways that had been impossible when the crimes first occurred. The task force submitted evidence from all 6 crime scenes for DNA testing, hoping to find biological material left behind by the killer: skin cells, hair follicles, saliva, blood, anything that might contain his genetic signature. The results were disappointing. The killer had been extraordinarily careful. He had apparently worn gloves, avoiding direct contact with surfaces. He had left no biological material behind, or at least none that could be definitively attributed to him rather than to the victims, investigating officers, or innocent customers who had been in the shops before the murders. One crime scene did yield a hair that didn't belong to the victim, or any known person who had been in the store. DNA was extracted from the hair follicle and analyzed, creating a genetic profile that investigators hoped belonged to the killer. This profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which compares DNA evidence from crime scenes to known offenders and other unsolved cases. There were no matches. The DA profile didn't correspond to anyone in the database, which meant the killer had never been convicted of a crime that required DNA submission, or he had committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard practice, or he had simply never been caught for anything. The DNA profile was preserved in the system, waiting for a match that might never come. Every time a new sample was added to CODIS, every time someone was convicted of a crime and had their DNA collected, the system would automatically check for matches against 70 case. The investigators knew it was a long shot, but it was one of the few proactive tools they had available. Fingerprint technology was also advancing. New chemical techniques could reveal prints that had been invisible using traditional methods. The task force had evidence from the crime scenes re-examined using these new techniques, hoping to find a latent print and had been missed in the original investigations. Again, the results were disappointing. A few prints were recovered, but none could be definitively attributed to the killer. Most were partial prints, smudged or unclear, not sufficient for identification purposes. The few clear prints that were found belonged to the victims, store employees, or customers who had been in the shops before the murders. The killer had been careful, perhaps obsessively so. He had avoided leaving the physical evidence that might have identified him. Whether through learning or experience with the criminal justice system, he had managed to commit 6 murders without leaving behind the clues that typically solve crimes. As the years passed, the original investigators began to retire or move on to other assignments. New detectives inherited the I-70 killer case, reading through the thick files, studying the crime scene photos, familiarizing themselves with the details of murders that had occurred before they joined the police force. This generational transition brought fresh perspectives, but also meant a loss of institutional memory. The original investigators had known the cases intimately. They had walked the crime scenes, interviewed the witnesses, felt the urgency of hunting an active serial killer. The new investigators were working cold cases, important but not immediate, tragic but not current. Still, they did their best to keep the investigation moving forward. They re-interviewed witnesses as new questions arose, applied new investigative techniques as they became available, followed up on tips that continued to trickle in years after the murders. In 1997, 5 years after the murders, the task force received an intriguing tip. A woman called from Arizona claiming that her ex-husband matched the description of the I-70 killer. He was the right age, had the right hair color, drove a similar vehicle. More significantly, he had been working as a traveling salesman in 1992, with a route that took him through several cities along Interstate 70, including Indianapolis, Wichita, and Kansas City. The timing of his travel schedule aligned disturbingly well with the murders. He had been in Indianapolis around the time Robin Fuldar was killed. He had been in the Wichita area when the Brettel Mart shootings occurred. His employment records placed him in or near each city where murders had taken place. The woman calling in the tip said her ex-husband had always frightened her, that there was something cold and detached about him, that he sometimes spoke about women in disturbing ways. She said she had thought about calling the police years earlier, but had been too afraid. Now, divorced and living in a different state, she felt safe enough to come forward. Investigators immediately began looking into this suspect. They obtained his employment records, confirming that his sales route had indeed taken him through the relevant cities. They tracked down his vehicle registration from 1992 and found that he had owned a light-colored sedan matching the general description of the I-70 killer's car. They located the man, who was now living in Nevada, and conducted a surveillance operation, watching his movements, trying to determine if he might still be dangerous. They obtained a warrant to search his residence, looking for a .22 caliber handgun or any evidence that might connect him to the murders. The search turned up nothing. The man didn't own a .22 caliber handgun, at least not currently. His current vehicle and residence showed no signs of violence or criminal activity. When investigators interviewed him, he was cooperative but firm he had nothing to do with the I-70 murders. They asked him to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. He refused and hired a lawyer, which was his legal right but which also made him seem more suspicious. However, without probable cause for an arrest, investigators couldn't compel him to provide DNA. They began building a more comprehensive profile of this suspect, hoping to find enough evidence to justify obtaining a search warrant for his DNA. They spoke to people who had known him in 1992, trying to place him more precisely in each city at the time of each murder. They examined his credit card records, looking for hotel stays or purchases that might put him near the crime scenes. But the evidence remained circumstantial. Yes, he had been in the general area of each city, but his sales territory covered a huge geographical region. Being in Kansas City during a particular week didn't mean at the exact moment Sarah Blessing was murdered. Yes, he matched the general description, but so did thousands of other men. Yes, his ex-wife found him frightening. but marital disputes and post-divorce animosity could easily explain her willingness to see him as a suspect. Without concrete evidence, a weapon, a witness identification, DNA, fingerprints, something definitive, the case against this suspect remained too weak to pursue. Investigators kept him on their radar, but they couldn't arrest him, couldn't charge him, couldn't even publicly identify him as a person of interest without risking a lawsuit. Years later, when the man died of natural causes in the mid-2000s, investigators obtained a court order to collect DNA from his body for comparison to the hair found at one of the I-70 crime scenes. The results came back negative. He wasn't a match. Another promising suspect eliminated, another dead end. The I-70 killer case became a source of frustration and fascination for a generation of investigators, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts. The case had everything that makes an unsolved mystery compelling: multiple victims, a clear pattern, a vanishing suspect, and enough evidence to create a detailed profile, but not enough to identify a specific person. True crime writers began including the I-70 killer in their books about unsolved serial murders. The case appeared in television documentaries and podcasts and magazine articles. Each retelling brought renewed public attention and a flood of tips to police departments. Though most of these tips were speculation rather than solid information, some amateur investigators became obsessed with the case, developing elaborate theories about the killer's identity, his motives, his fate. Internet forums dedicated to unsolved crimes featured lengthy discussions about the I-70 murders, with participants debating every detail, proposing suspects, arguing about evidence. One popular theory held that the killer had been a truck driver, someone who regularly traveled Interstate 70 as part of his job, which would explain his knowledge of the highway, his ability to move between cities without raising suspicion, and his apparent comfort operating in different locations. This theory was supported by criminal profilers who noted that several serial killers had been truck drivers, using their occupation as cover for their crimes. Another theory suggested the killer had been a military veteran, someone with firearms training and possibly combat experience, which would explain his cold efficiency and his precise shooting. Proponents of this theory pointed to the calculated nature of the murders, the lack of emotion or hesitation, the professional execution. They suggested checking military discharge records from the late 1980s and early 1990s, looking for someone who fit the profile and had been dishonorably discharged or had psychological problems. A darker theory proposed that the killer had never stopped murdering, but had simply changed his methods or moved to a different region, making it impossible to connect his later crimes to the I-70 series. This theory was disturbing because it suggested that somewhere, additional victims existed, women who had been murdered by the same man, but whose deaths had never been linked to the original 6. Some theorists believed the killer had died shortly after the last murder, either by suicide accident or natural causes, which would explain why the murders stopped so abruptly. They pointed to the compressed timeline, 6 murders in 29 days, as evidence of someone in a psychological crisis, someone spiraling out of control, someone whose murderous spree might have ended with their own death. A more conspiracy-minded theory suggested the killer had been caught for unrelated crime and was currently in prison, possibly under a different name, possibly in a different state, his connection to the I-70 murders unknown to the authorities holding him. Proponents of this theory advocated for cross-referencing prison populations with the suspect profile, looking for anyone incarcerated shortly after May 1992 who matched the description. Each theory had its adherents and its critics. None could be proven or disproven with the available evidence. The case remained stubbornly unsolved, resistant to even the most creative investigative efforts. As the year 2000 approached, the I-70 killer case was nearly a decade old. The victims' families had tried to move forward with their lives, though the loss never truly healed. They had created memorials, established scholarships in their loved ones' names, found ways to honor the memories of the women who had been taken from them. Robin Fuldor's family created a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in business, honoring Robin's entrepreneurial spirit and her dreams of building something meaningful. Every year, a deserving student received financial assistance to pursue her education, keeping Robin's memory alive through the success of others. Patricia Mager's family established a fund to support victims of violent crime, recognizing that Patricia's death had left them grieving but also struggling with practical matters, funeral costs, counseling expenses, lost income. They wanted to help other families facing similar circumstances to create something positive from their tragedy. Nancy Kitzmiller's daughter, now an adult, had become an advocate for crime victims' rights, speaking publicly about the impact of unsolved murders on families, pushing for better resources for cold case investigations. She refused to let her mother's death be forgotten, refused to accept that the killer would never face justice. Sarah Blessing's family had established a memorial garden at their church, a quiet place where people could sit and reflect, where Sarah's love of beauty and creativity was honored through flowers and art. They held an annual remembrance service, inviting the community to join them in honoring Sarah's memory and praying for justice. Mildred Hodges' grandchildren, who had been young when she was murdered, were now adults themselves. Some with children of their own who would never know their great-grandmother. They told stories about Mildred, passing down memories of her kindness, her strength, her dedication to family. They made sure the youngest generation knew about the woman they had lost. Vicky Heath's fiancé had eventually married someone else and started a family, but he never forgot Vicky or the life they should have had together. He kept a photograph of her in his home office, a reminder of young love and dreams cut short. He told his children about Vicky, making sure they understood that their father had once loved someone who was taken from him by violence. These families waited for justice. They waited for the phone call that would tell them the killer had been caught, that he would face trial, that he would be punished. They waited for closure that seemed like it would never come. In 2001, nearly 10 years after the murders, the I-70 Killer Task Force received information that would reignite the investigation and raise new questions about connections between different serial murder cases. Investigators in Texas contacted the I-70 task force with information about a series of murders that had occurred in their state during the same general period as the I-70 killings. These murders, which occurred in several Texas cities between 1991 and 1993, shared some characteristics with the I-70 series. The Texas victims were women working in various service and retail positions. They had been shot with small-caliber weapons. Several of the murders occurred near major highways. The crimes showed no signs of robbery or sexual assault. Could these Texas murders be connected to the I-70 series? Had the killer been operating in Texas before or after his Midwest spree? The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. A joint task force was formed, bringing together investigators from multiple states to examine the potential connections between the I-70 murders and the Texas cases. They compared every available detail: ballistics, victim profiles, crime scene characteristics, geographical patterns, timeline analysis. The ballistic evidence was examined first. If the same weapon had been used in both series of murders, that would be strong evidence of a connection. But the analysis revealed that while the murders in both series involved small-caliber weapons, the specific ballistic signatures didn't match. The bullets recovered from the Texas crime scenes had different rifling patterns than those from the I-70 murders, indicating different weapons had been used. This finding didn't completely rule out a connection. A serial killer could certainly use different weapons for different crimes, but it made the connection less likely. The I-70 killer had used the same weapon for all 6 confirmed murders, suggesting it held some significance for him. Why would he use a different weapon in Texas? The geographical analysis also raised questions. The Texas murders occurred in cities scattered across the state, without the clear interstate highway pattern that characterized the I-70 series. Some were near highways, but not in the systematic way that the I-70 murders had been. The timeline was problematic as well. Some of the Texas murders occurred in 1991, before the I-70 series began. Others occurred in 1993 after the I-70 murders stopped. If they were all committed by the same person, it suggested a longer pattern of activity than the concentrated 29-day spree that defined the I-70 series. After months of investigation and analysis, The Joint Task Force concluded that while similarities existed between the Texas murders and the I-70 series, there was insufficient evidence to definitively link them to the same perpetrator. The similarities appeared to be coincidental, the result of common victim selection and method, rather than a shared killer. However, the investigation did highlight a disturbing reality. During the early 1990s, multiple serial killers were operating across the United States, targeting vulnerable women using similar methods and evading capture. The I-70 killer was just one predator among several, and the challenges of investigating these crimes, the lack of physical evidence, the geographical spread, the random victim selection, were similar across different cases. This realization prompted law enforcement agencies to improve their information sharing and coordination. Regional databases were expanded, communication protocols were improved, and efforts were made to identify connections between crimes more quickly. But for the I-70 killer investigation specifically, these improvements came too late. The trail was cold, the evidence was old, and despite better tools and techniques, investigators were no closer to identifying their suspect than they had been in 1992. The early 2000s brought new technological advances that investigators hoped might finally crack the I-70 case. Forensic genealogy, using DNA to identify suspects through their family relationships, was beginning to show promise as an investigative tool. The technique works by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic profiles in genealogical databases, looking for partial matches that indicate family relationships. If a suspect's cousin or second cousin has submitted their DNA to a genealogy website, investigators can potentially identify family lineages and narrow down suspect pools. The hair found at one of the I-70 crime scenes, the one that had yielded a DNA profile, became the focus of renewed attention. Investigators hoped that genealogical DNA analysis might succeed where traditional DNA matching had failed. They submitted the DNA profile to genealogy databases, looking for familial matches. The process was painstaking, involving thousands of potential family trees, countless hours of genealogical research, and complex probability calculations. Several partial matches were identified, suggesting possible family connections. Investigators followed these leads, building family trees, identifying potential suspects within the family lines that matched the DNA profile. But each lead ultimately ended in disappointment. Some potential suspects were ruled out because they had died before the murders occurred. Others had alibis that placed them far from the crime scenes. Some were the wrong age or didn't match the physical description. In several cases, investigators were able to obtain DNA samples that definitively excluded the person as a suspect. The genealogical approach, while promising, required the killer's relatives to have submitted their DNA to public databases, something that was far from guaranteed. If the killer came from a family that valued privacy, or if his family members simply hadn't participated in genetic testing, this investigative avenue would lead nowhere. As the genealogical investigation continued to pursue various leads without success, investigators began to consider another possibility. Perhaps the DNA from the hair didn't belong to the killer at all. Hair evidence can be unreliable. A single hair could have been transferred to the crime scene innocently, or could have been present before the murder occurred, or could have come from a police officer or medical examiner during the investigation. Without additional biological evidence to corroborate the hair, without a clear chain of custody proving the hair had been deposited by the killer, the DNA profile remained a question mark rather than a definitive clue. As the I-70 killer case entered its second decade without resolution, a new generation of investigators approached the evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. The advancement of forensic science, the digitization of records, and the rise of social media and online communities created opportunities that hadn't existed when the murders first occurred. In 2008, 16 years after the murders, the case received renewed attention when a cold case detective in Indianapolis decided to conduct a comprehensive review of all the evidence. Detective Michael Harrison had not been involved in the original investigation, which meant he could approach the case without preconceptions or emotional attachments to particular theories. Harrison began by organizing everything the task force had accumulated over the years: witness statements, crime scene photos, ballistic replay analysis, tip sheets, suspect files, everything. He created a digital database, making the information searchable and cross-referenceable in ways that had been impossible with paper files. This systematic organization revealed patterns that hadn't been obvious before. Harrison noticed that several witnesses across different cities had mentioned seeing a man with a distinctive walk, slightly bow-legged with a rolling gait. This detail had been noted in individual reports, but never compiled or highlighted as a potentially identifying characteristic. He also noticed that multiple witnesses had mentioned the suspect's vehicle had an out-of-state license plate, though no one could remember which state. This suggested the killer might not have been a local resident in any of the cities where he murdered, which supported the theory that he was traveling along I-70 for work or other purposes. Harrison created a timeline that included not just the 6 confirmed murders, but also every reported sighting of the suspect or his vehicle, every tip that had come in, every potential connection that had been investigated. This comprehensive timeline revealed gaps that might be significant, periods where the killer appeared to be in a particular city, but hadn't struck, suggesting either reconnaissance or aborted attempts. Most intriguingly, Harrison noticed that several witnesses in Wichita had reported seeing a man matching the suspect's description at a laundromat near the brutal morning of April 11, 1992, hours before Patricia Majors and Patricia Smith were shot. The man had seemed agitated, pacing while his clothes washed, frequently checking his watch. At the time, this sighting had been noted but not emphasized, just another tip among thousands. But Harrison wondered if this represented the killer preparing for his crime, working up his nerve, going through his pre-murder routine. If so, the laundromat might have been a location the killer visited regularly, a mundane stop that was part of his normal pattern. Harrison began checking laundromats near the other crime scenes, looking for similar reports of a suspicious man. He found nothing concrete, but the possibility intrigued him. Serial killers often have rituals, routines they follow before committing their crimes. If the I-70 killer had a specific pattern of behavior before each murder, identifying that pattern might provide clues to his identity or background. This fresh analysis of old evidence didn't solve the case, but it did generate new investigative leads. Harrison compiled a list of questions that had never been adequately answered. Why did the killer return to St. Charles after already murdering Nancy Kitzmiller there? Why did he stop after Vicky Hith's murder? Had something gone wrong during that last crime that frightened him or satisfied whatever drove him? And perhaps most importantly, where was he now? The question of what happened to the I-70 killer after May 1992 haunted investigators. Serial killers typically don't just stop killing unless something forces them to death, incarceration, physical incapacity, or a major life change that addresses whatever psychological need drives their violence. Several scenarios seemed possible, each with different implications for the investigation. The first scenario was death. The killer might have died shortly after the last murder, suicide, accident, or natural causes. This would explain the sudden cessation of the murder series, and the lack of any similar crimes in the years that followed. Some investigators believed this was the most likely explanation. Given how abruptly the killing stopped, the second scenario was incarceration. The killer might have been arrested for an unrelated crime shortly after May 1992 and imprisoned before he could kill again. This was a compelling theory because it explained both the sudden stop and the killer's failure to appear in any database searches. If he was using a different name, or if his crimes had occurred in a jurisdiction that didn't share information effectively, he might be sitting in prison somewhere. His connection to the I-70 murders unknown. Detective Harrison decided to pursue this theory systematically. He obtained lists of men who had been incarcerated in multiple states between May 1992 and December 1992, focusing on those who matched the suspect profile: white males aged 25 to 35, with light-colored hair, average height and build. The list contained thousands of names. Harrison and his team began the painstaking process of investigating each one, looking for anyone who had been free during April and May of 1992, who had access to the cities where the murders occurred, who had a history of violence, and who owned or had access to a .22 caliber weapon, Several promising candidates emerged. One man had been arrested in June 1992 for assault with a deadly weapon in Oklahoma. He matched the physical description. He had been working as a delivery driver with a route along I-70, and he owned multiple firearms including a .22 caliber pistol. Harrison traveled to the Oklahoma prison where this man was serving his sentence. The inmate agreed to be interviewed, confident and cooperative. He denied any involvement in the I-70 murders, claimed he had never been to several of the cities where the crimes occurred, and insisted his .22 caliber pistol had been lost or stolen before the murders took place. Harrison asked the man to provide a DNA sample for comparison to the evidence from the crime scenes. The inmate agreed without hesitation, which suggested either innocence or supreme confidence that his DNA wouldn't match. The test came back negative. Once again, a promising suspect was eliminated. This pattern repeated itself with several other incarcerated individuals who matched the profile. Each seemed like a strong possibility, each was thoroughly investigated, and each was ultimately ruled out through DNA testing or solid alibis. The third scenario Harrison considered was that the killer had moved to a different region and changed his method, making it impossible to connect his later crimes to the I-70 series. This was perhaps the most disturbing possibility, because it suggested additional victims existed, women whose murders had never been linked to the original 6. Harrison began searching databases for unsolved murders of women across the United States, focusing on the period from mid-1992 onward, looking for any cases that might represent an evolution of the I-70 killer's methodology. He found hundreds of case stores women, shelled in seemingly motiveless attacks, women murdered by unknown assailants, but none of them bore the precise signature of the I-70 crimes. None had the same combination of factors: lone women in small retail shops, shot in the head with a .22 caliber weapon, no robbery, no sexual assault, locations near interstate highways, murders occurring in the late morning hours. Either the I-70 killer had stopped completely, or he had changed his methods so dramatically that his later crimes were unrecognizable as related to his earlier work. The fourth scenario was that the killer had simply stopped of his own volition, either because whatever psychological crisis had driven the 29-day murder spree had resolved itself, or because the increasing police pressure had frightened him into dormancy. Some serial killers do experience cooling-off periods lasting years or even decades. The BTK killer Dennis Rader had committed murders in the 1970s, then gone dormant for years before killing again in the 1990s. If the I-70 killer followed a similar pattern, he might still be out there, living a normal life, appearing to be an ordinary citizen, his murderous past known only to himself. He might be working a regular job, married with children, integrated into a community, indistinguishable from any other middle-aged man. This possibility was chilling because it meant the killer could still be a threat, that given the right trigger or stressor, he might kill again. It also meant that someone somewhere might know him, might live with him, work alongside him, be related to him without having any idea of what he had done. In 2010, 18 years after the murders, the case received unexpected attention when a popular true crime television program featured the I-70 killer as an unsolved mystery. The episode included interviews with surviving family members, former investigators, and criminal psychologists who offered their insights into the killer's possible identity and motivations. The broadcast reached millions of viewers and generated a massive response. The tip lines were flooded with calls from people who claimed to have information about the murders. Most were well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful, people reporting vague memories or suspicious neighbors who happened to match the general description. But among the hundreds of tips were a few that seemed genuinely promising. One caller, a woman in her 60s, reported that her brother-in-law had worked as a long-haul trucker in the early 1990s, traveling Interstate 70 regularly. She said he had always made her uncomfortable, that there was something cold and predatory about him, and that he had disappeared for several weeks in the spring of 1992, claiming to be on an extended haul but providing no details. The woman said her brother-in-law matched the physical description of the I-70 killer, that he owned guns including what she believed was a .22 caliber pistol, and that he had become increasingly paranoid after the I-70 murders were publicized, constantly watching news coverage and becoming agitated whenever the case was mentioned. Most significantly, she reported that her brother-in-law had died in 2007, which would explain why he had never been caught and why the murders had stopped so abruptly. Investigators immediately began researching this lead. They obtained the deceased trucker's employment records and confirmed that his road had indeed taken him through Indianapolis, Wichita, Kansas City, St. Charles, and Terre Haute during April and May of 1992. The timing aligned almost perfectly with the murders. They interviewed the woman extensively, asking her to provide as much detail as possible about her brother-in-law's behavior, appearance, and activities during the relevant time period. She described a man who matched the suspect profile in almost every particular: white, late 20s in 1992, reddish blonde hair, average height and build, slightly bow-legged walk. She also mentioned that he had sold his truck and trailer in late 1992, switching to a different line of work, and that he had moved to a different state shortly afterward, almost as if he were trying to distance himself from his past. The investigators' excitement grew. This seemed like the most credible lead they had received in years. They began the process of obtaining a court order to exhume the body for DNA testing. But when they attempted to locate the burial site, they encountered an unexpected problem. The man had been cremated. His ashes had been scattered, making DNA testing impossible. There was no biological material available for comparison to the crime scenes. The investigators were devastated. They had finally found a suspect who matched the profile perfectly, whose timeline aligned with the murders, whose behavior suggested guilt and paranoia. But without DNA, without any way to definitively prove he was the killer, the case remained unresolved. They pursued other avenues to confirm or eliminate this suspect. They searched for photographs from 1992, hoping to show them to Patricia Smith, the Wichita survivor, to see if she could identify him as her attacker. But very few photographs existed, and those that did were poor quality, taken from angles that made identification impossible. They searched for the .22 caliber pistol the man had supposedly owned, hoping to recover it and test it against the ballistic evidence from the murders. But the gun had apparently been sold or disposed of years earlier. His relatives didn't know what had happened to it. They interviewed everyone who had known the man, looking for anyone who might have noticed suspicious behavior or absences during the critical time period. But 18 years had passed, memories had faded, and no one could provide concrete information that would definitively place him at any of the crime scenes. In the end, the deceased trucker became another frustrating, possible but unproven suspect. Everything about him fit the profile, everything suggested he could have been the I-70 killer. But without definitive proof, without DNA, without the murder weapon, without a witness identification, investigators couldn't close the case with confidence. The man's name was added to a list of persons of strong interest. In the I-70 murders, individuals who couldn't be definitively ruled in or ruled out as suspects. It was a list that had grown depressingly long over the years, a catalog of men who might have been the killer but could never be proven to be so. As the case entered its third decade without resolution, the original investigators who had worked the murders in 1992 were mostly retired. The victims' families were older now, some had passed away, leaving behind children and grandchildren, who barely remembered the women who had been murdered. Robin Fuldaur's parents had died without ever knowing who killed their daughter. Her siblings kept her memory alive, but the pain had dulled somewhat with time, though the anger at the lack of justice never fully faded. Patricia Mager's husband had remarried and built a new life, but he never forgot his first wife or the brutal way she had been taken from him. He attended every press conference about the case, hoping each time that this would be the day they announced an arrest, knowing each time that it probably wouldn't be. Patricia Smith, the Wichita survivor, lived with permanent disabilities from her brain injury. She required ongoing care and would never fully recover. Her life had been irrevocably changed by a man whose face she could barely remember, who had destroyed her future in a moment of senseless violence. Nancy Kitzmiller's daughter was now middle-aged, with children of her own. She told her kids about their grandmother, about the vibrant woman they would never meet, about the injustice that still burned in the family's collective heart. Sarah Blessing's husband had also remarried, but he made sure his new wife understood that Sarah would always hold a place in his heart. He kept photographs of Sarah in the house, spoke about her to his children, refused to let her memory fade. Mildred Hodges' grandchildren were adults now, some with families of their own. They passed down stories about their grandmother, keeping her memory alive through generations who had never known her, except through tales told by those who loved her. Vicky Heath's fiancé had children who were now the age Vicky had been when she died. Looking at his daughter, seeing her youth and promise and the whole life ahead of her, he was struck anew by the tragedy of Vicky's murder, by all the years she should have had and didn't. These families had lived for decades without closure, without justice, without answers. They had created meaning from tragedy as best they could: scholarships, memorials, advocacy work, anything to ensure their loved ones weren't forgotten. But what they wanted most, what they had wanted for 20 years, was to know that the man who had destroyed their families had been caught, had been punished, had faced consequences for what he had done. That satisfaction remained elusive. In 2012, exactly 20 years after the murders, Detective Harrison organized a comprehensive cold case review, bringing together current investigators, retired detectives who had worked the original case, FBI profilers, and forensic specialists. The goal was to approach the evidence with completely fresh perspectives, to question every assumption, to look for connections or clues that might have been missed. The review lasted several days and covered every aspect of the case. Crime scene photos were examined once again. Witness statements were reread and analyzed. The timeline was reconstructed. The suspect list was reviewed. Every piece of physical evidence was reassessed in light of current forensic capabilities. One of the forensic specialists proposed a new approach to the ballistic evidence. While the bullets themselves had been extensively analyzed, he suggested examining the striations on the bullets with newer, more sophisticated comparison technology. These advanced systems use 3D imaging to create detailed models of the bullets' surfaces, allowing for more precise comparisons than traditional microscopic analysis. The bullets from all 6 crime scenes were sent to a specialized ballistics laboratory for this enhanced analysis. The results confirmed what had been determined years earlier. All 6 murders had been committed with the same weapon, a .22 caliber handgun with distinctive rifling characteristics. But the new analysis also revealed something additional. The wear patterns on the bullets suggested the gun had been fired extensively before the murders occurred. This indicated someone who was comfortable with firearms, who practiced regularly, who was familiar with his weapon. It supported the theory that the killer might have military or law enforcement training. The profilers at the review session offered updated psychological assessments based on decades of research into serial killer behavior that had been conducted since the original profile was created in 1992. They emphasized that the choice of victims, women working alone in vulnerable positions, suggested someone who felt powerless in his personal life, who needed to exert control over others to compensate for his own feelings of inadequacy. The fact that he targeted women across a wide age range, from 23 to 65, suggested the murders weren't primarily sexually motivated but were about power and dominance. The compressed timeline, 6 murders in 29 days, indicated a psychological crisis or breaking point. Something had triggered the killer in early April 1992. Some stressor or life event that had pushed him to begin acting out his violent fantasies. The profilers suggested looking at what life events commonly trigger such behavior: job loss, divorce, death of a parent or spouse, financial crisis, romantic rejection. If investigators could identify men who had experienced such crises in March or early April of 1992, who matched the physical profile and had access to the cities where the murders occurred, they might be able to narrow their suspect pool significantly. This insight led to a new investigative approach. Detectives began searching records from early 1992, looking for men who had been fired from jobs, gone through divorces, filed for bankruptcy, or otherwise experienced documented crises during that time period. They focused on individuals who matched the suspect profile, and had some connection to Interstate 70 or the cities where the murders occurred. The search generated dozens of names, but investigating each one was enormously time-consuming. Many of the relevant records from 1992 were not digitized, requiring manual searches through archive files. Some records had been destroyed in accordance with retention policies. Privacy laws complicated access to certain types of information. Nevertheless, the team pursued this approach systematically, investigating each person who met the criteria. Several seemed promising initially, but each was eventually eliminated through DA testing alibis, or other evidence that excluded them as suspects. One particularly interesting candidate emerged from this research, a man who had been fired from his job as a deliverman in March 1992, who had subsequently gone through a bitter divorce, and who had access to a company vehicle that matched the description of the suspect's car. His route had included several cities along I-70, and he had no verifiable alibi for several of the murder dates. Investigators tracked this man down and requested an interview. He agreed to talk but denied any involvement in the murders. He provided DNA voluntarily, confident it wouldn't match the evidence. The DNA test came back negative. Another suspect eliminated. As the 20-year anniversary of the murders passed, and the case entered its third decade, a disturbing pattern became. Every promising lead eventually ended in disappointment. Every suspect who seemed perfect was ultimately ruled out. Every new forensic technique or investigative approach failed to provide the breakthrough everyone hoped for. Detective Harrison, now the lead investigator on the case, began to wonder if the I-70 killer had been extraordinarily lucky, or if he possessed some knowledge or skill that allowed him to avoid leaving the evidence that typically solves crimes. Some serial killers are caught quickly because they're sloppy, impulsive, or driven by compulsions that override their caution. Others, like the BTK killer or the Golden State Killer, evade capture for decades precisely because they're careful, methodical, and patient. The I-70 killer appeared to fall into the latter category. He had committed 6 murders without leaving behind useful fingerprints, without being clearly seen and identified by witnesses, without making the mistakes that typically lead to arrest. This suggested either exceptional luck or exceptional planning. Harrison developed a theory that the I-70 killer might have studied criminal investigation techniques, might have understood what evidence police look for, and taken deliberate steps to avoid leaving it. This would explain the use of gloves, the choice of a small caliber weapon that was easy to conceal and dispose of, the selection of isolated victims who couldn't immediately call for help, and the rapid departure from each crime scene before witnesses could gather detailed information. If this theory was correct, the killer might have a background in law enforcement, security work, or military intelligence, fields that would provide knowledge of investigative techniques. Alternatively, he might simply have been an avid reader of true crime books, or someone who had studied criminal investigation out of personal interest. This theory led Harrison to examine whether any of the persons of interest who had been investigated over the years had backgrounds that would provide this kind of knowledge. He found a few who had military experience, one who had worked briefly as a security guard, and another who had taken criminal justice courses at a community college. But none of these individuals could be definitively connected to the murders. The military veterans had alibis or didn't match the physical description. The security guard had died in the late 1990s, and attempts to obtain DNA posthumously had been unsuccessful. The criminal justice student had moved to Europe in 1991 and hadn't returned to the United States until 1993. Each potential connection led to another dead end. Harrison began to wonder if the case would ever be solved. 20 years of investigation by dozens of skilled detectives using increasingly sophisticated technology had failed to identify the killer. How much longer could they reasonably expect to continue finding new leads or discovering overlooked evidence? In 2015, 23 years after the murders, a breakthrough occurred in a completely different cold case that would inspire new hope for the I-70 investigation. The Golden State Killer case, which had remained unsolved for decades, was finally cracked using forensic genealogy, comparing crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases identifying family relationships, and using that information to narrow down suspects until a specific individual could be identified. The technique had been used on smaller cases before, but the Golden State Killer case demonstrated that even decades-old evidence could be successfully analyzed using this approach, and that even the most careful serial killers could be identified if they had relatives who had participated in genetic testing. Detective Harrison immediately saw the potential application to the I-70 killer case. They had DNA from the hair found at one of the crime scenes. If they could find a familial match in a genealogy database, they might finally be able to identify their killer, or at least narrow the suspect pool to a manageable number of individuals within a particular family tree. Harrison assembled a team that included a forensic genealogist, DNA specialists, and experienced investigators. They submitted the I-70 DNA profile to several public genealogy databases, looking for any partial matches that might indicate family relationships. The initial results were disappointing. No close matches appeared, no parents, siblings, or first cousins. But there were several distant matches, indicating possible relationships at the level of second cousins, third cousins, or even more distant connections. The forensic genealogist began the painstaking work of building family trees from these distant matches, trying to identify common ancestors and map out extended family networks. This process could take months or even years, requiring research into historical records, obituaries, marriage certificates, birth records, and any other documentation that might help construct accurate family trees. The work was complicated by several factors. Many families had members who had moved frequently, making it difficult to track lineages across different states and regions. Some family lines ended in dead ends where no further records could be found. Privacy concerns and DNA database policies limited access to certain information. But the genealogist persisted, slowly building out family trees from multiple distant matches, looking for points where these trees intersected, indicating potential suspects who could be related to multiple matches. After months of work, the genealogist identified 3 extended family networks that might contain the I-70 killer. Within these family networks, there were dozens of men who would have been the right age in 1992 and who couldn't be immediately ruled out. Harrison and his team began the process of investigating each of these men, looking for any who had connections to Interstate 70, who had been in the Midwest during April and May of 1992, who matched the physical description, and who had histories that might suggest violent tendencies. Several candidates emerged who seemed worth pursuing more aggressively. Investigators began conducting surveillance, interviewing relatives and associates, building comprehensive profiles of these individuals' lives and movements. The genealogical investigation consumed the next 2 years of Detective Harrison's life. Each family tree led to dozens of potential suspects, each requiring thorough background investigation. Some men had died, necessitating efforts to obtain posthumous DNA samples. Others had moved overseas, creating jurisdictional complications. Many simply didn't match the timeline or physical description when examined closely. By 2017, Harrison's team had narrowed their focus to 5 individuals who couldn't be easily eliminated. Each matched the age range, had some connection to the Midwest, and belonged to family lines that matched the distant DNA relatives identified through genealogy databases. The first suspect was a former salesman who had traveled extensively in the early 1990s. Investigators obtained his DNA through a discarded coffee cup and submitted it for testing. The results came back negative, not a match. The second suspect had died in 2003. His family refused to cooperate with exhumation requests, forcing investigators to pursue a court order. By the time legal permission was granted and the body exhumed, decomposition had advanced to the point where usable DNA could not be reliably extracted. Another dead end. The third suspect agreed to ID involuntarily, confident in his innocence. He was eliminated within weeks. The fourth suspect was serving time in federal prison for an unrelated crime. Access to him was complicated by bureaucratic procedures, but eventually investigators obtained a DNA sample. Negative. The fifth suspect had moved to Canada in 1995 and established a new life there. International cooperation allowed investigators to obtain his DNA, but the testing process took months due to chain of custody requirements across borders. When results finally arrived in late 2017, they were negative. Harrison felt the weight of disappointment settle over him like a heavy blanket. The genealogical approach, which had seemed so promising, had yielded nothing. Either the original DNA sample didn't actually belong to the killer, or the killer's family simply hadn't participated in genetic testing, or the genealogical connections were too distant to reliably identify the correct family line. The investigation continued, but the energy and optimism had drained away. 25 years had passed since the murders. Most of the original investigators had retired or passed away. The victims' families were tired of false hopes and disappointing updates. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. In 2018, Detective Harrison retired from the police force. At his retirement party, he spoke about defined his career. But he returned again and again to the I-70 killer investigation. It haunted him that after a decade of work, after pursuing every lead and employing every technique available, he was leaving the case unsolved. 6 women died, he told the assembled colleagues and friends. 6 families were destroyed, and the man who did it is still out there. Or he died without ever facing justice. That's the part I can't accept, that someone could do something so evil and never pay for it. A younger detective, Sarah Chen, inherited primary responsibility for the I-70 killer case. She approached it with fresh determination, reviewing all the work Harrison and his predecessors had done, looking for anything that might have been missed. Chen focused particularly on the question of why the murders stopped so abruptly after Vicky Heath's death. Most serial killers don't simply stop unless forced to. She developed a theory that something significant had happened to the killer in mid-May 1992, something that either prevented him from continuing or eliminated his desire to kill. She searched for men matching the suspect profile who had died, been hospitalized, been arrested, or experienced major life changes in May or June of 1992. The search generated dozens of names, but most had already been investigated and eliminated over the years. One name that caught Chen's attention was a man who had committed suicide in June 1992, just weeks after the last murder. He had been found in his apartment in Oklahoma City, a .22 caliber revolver in his hand, a single gunshot wound to the head. At the time of his death, the man had been identified as a drifter with no permanent address and few personal possessions. Local police had treated it as a routine suicide, a troubled man with no family and no prospects who had chosen to end his life. The case had been closed quickly with minimal investigation. But Chen noticed something interesting. Oklahoma City is located along Interstate 40, which intersects with Interstate 70. The man's approximate age in 1992 would have been late 20s or early 30s. Physical descriptions from the suicide report were vague, but mentioned light-colored hair. Chen tried to track down more information about this individual, but the trail was frustratingly sparse. The man had used several different names, making it difficult to construct a reliable background. No photographs existed in the police files. The body had been cremated after no next of kin claimed it. Chen couldn't prove this man was 70 killer, but she couldn't rule him out either. He joined the long list of possible but unproven suspects, men who might have been responsible but could never be definitively identified. As 2020 arrived, bringing with it the pandemic that would reshape the world, the I-70 killer case marked 28 years without resolution. The investigation continued at a reduced pace, with Chen periodically reviewing evidence and following up on occasional tips that still trickled in. The case had become something a legend in law enforcement circles, the perfect unsolved mystery. The serial killer who appeared and disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind just enough evidence to tantalize investigators, but never enough to lead to an arrest. True crime podcasts and documentary series continued to feature the I-70 murders, each offering theories about the killer's identity, each sparking renewed public interest and generating tips that usually led nowhere. The victims' families had largely given up hope of seeing justice in their lifetimes. Some had passed away. Others had made peace with the likelihood that the case would never be solved. They focused instead on keeping their loved ones' memories alive, ensuring that Robin, Patricia, Nancy, Sarah, Mildred, and Vicky were remembered as people, not just as victims in an unsolved case. Detective Chen continued to work the case when time permitted, still believing that somewhere in the accumulated evidence, In the thousands of pages of reports and statements and analyses lay the clue that would finally identify the I-70 killer. But as the years passed with no breakthrough, even her optimism began to waver. Perhaps some cases simply couldn't be solved. Perhaps some killers were lucky enough or careful enough to evade justice. Perhaps evil sometimes wins. Today, more than 3 decades after the murders, the I-70 killer case remains open. The investigation continues, though at a slower pace than in those frantic early months of 1992. New tips are still followed up. Evidence is periodically re-examined using the latest forensic techniques. Hope persists, however faint, that the case might someday be solved. Detective Sarah Chen still reviews the files regularly, still searches for the connection that everyone has missed. She knows the odds of solving a case this old are minimal, but she refuses to give up completely. 6 women deserve justice, even if it comes decades late. The families of the victims have aged, scattered, moved on with their lives as best they can. Some have passed away without ever knowing who killed their loved one. The younger generation, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the victims, know the story only through family tales and internet research. They visit memorials, maintain scholarship funds, keep the memories alive. Robin Foldower, Patricia Majors, Nancy Kitzmiller, Sarah Mildred Hodges. It's names that should represent ordinary lives fully lived, but instead represent lives cut short by senseless violence. Theories about the killer's identity continue to circulate. Was he a truck driver who died shortly after the last murder? A salesman who moved overseas? A drifter who committed suicide? A military veteran who was incarcerated for unrelated crimes? Or is he still alive somewhere, an elderly man now, living quietly with the knowledge of what he did 30 years ago? The psychological profile suggests a deeply disturbed individual, someone who derived satisfaction from the act of murder itself, who felt powerful in those moments when he held life and death in his hands. Someone who targeted vulnerable women because they represented everything he couldn't control in his own life. But profiles don't catch killers, evidence does, and despite decades of investigation, the evidence has never quite been enough. The case stands as a reminder of the limitations of even the most dedicated police work. Sometimes, despite thousands of hours of investigation, despite the best forensic science, despite the commitment of talented detectives across multiple generations, the truth remains elusive. The I-70 killer walked into 6 shops in the spring of 1992, murdered 6 women, and walked away. He was seen by witnesses, he left behind evidence, he created a clear pattern that should have led to his identification. Yet he was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. Somewhere, the truth exists. Whether the killer is alive or dead, whether he's in prison for other crimes or living as a respected member of some community, the truth is out there. Perhaps someday it will be discovered, a deathbed confession, a genealogical match, a witness coming forward with information they've kept secret for decades. Until then, the I-70 killer case remains open, a testament to the 6 women who lost their lives, and a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.